Welcome to another episode of Faith in Media with me, Carla, your host. And I'm so pleased to be joined by our guest today, James Cary. James, thank you so much for joining us here at Faith in Media. How are you today?
I'm really good. I'm very well. I'm very excited to be talking to you.
Oh, amazing. Now, we know that you are a sitcom writer for TV and radio and a stand-up theologian, which I think is a wonderful array of hats to be wearing. But I always feel it's better when our guests introduce and kind of tell us about themselves. So please share how are all of these things coming about and tell us more about yourself.
Well, listeners might already be thinking, stand-up theologian, that's not a thing. And in one sense,
now.
they're right. It's not. I've sort of made it up because I've ended up where I am, sort of doing live shows, comedy shows, but that are based on the Bible. So they're sort of designed to be funny, but they are biblical in content. And I guess it's a running theme. And as I say in that show, I just did one called Water into Wine. And at the beginning of that show, I do say that I've just always been interested in the Bible, as a, particularly from a Christian perspective. I'm a Christian and was raised in a Christian school and taken to church as a child and all that kind of stuff, and happily accepted it. No great conversion experience stories, just a kind of an acceptance. And then but I've always been interested in comedy. I've always absolutely loved comedy. Always wanted to know how it works. I want to know, and I watched it as a kid on the TV. I just didn't see I didn't see the point of anything on TV that wasn't either comedy or cricket. I had no use for anything else. So I think the more I was interested in comedy, and the more you think about how it works, you sort of end up going down the writer line, and so that's kind of what I did, really. So that's where that's how I've ended up. That's the beginning and the end, I guess. Not that now is the end, I hope. I've just turned 48, so I've got a few miles in me left. Yeah,
absolutely.
I think.
Gosh, I think in some ways that's normally, it sounds like you're about to start something new again at that kind of season.
Well, exactly.
Exciting.
Yeah.
What I love is that you're a comedian, you're unabashed. I love, I've been a Christian, there's no fancy conversion story. Why comedy? And it's not really something that you regularly come across within the Christian circles. It's normally something that's deemed as quite serious. It is. And a whole array of other things in good ways and sacred ways and hopeful ways, but comedy. And I think that's so refreshing. Why comedy for you?
Well, life is comic, life is funny. And because because we have a soul, and because we can imagine alternative worlds in the way that animals can't, we can see the gap between how the world is and how the world is supposed to be. And so we can see that someone intended to do one thing and actually another thing happened. And don't want to get too boringly technical about comedy. I've read books written by German and Danish philosophers, and wow, they are the least funny books you will ever books about comedy from an academic perspective are easily the least. They're so boring. So boring. So I think life is funny because we're able to take a step back and just sort of see. And you have those moments yourself when you realize that either God or the universe, depending on your perspective, is having a good old joke with you. And you can see how you would have liked things to have worked out and how they actually worked out. And so for that not to be... So if the Bible is a book which is inerrant, in my view, inspired, it is for all people in all times, in all places. Yeah. This is everything we need for righteousness. For it not to be funny at all would be very strange and dehumanizing. And I think when you do meet someone who has no sense of humor, you do sense that there is something missing. You actually, I don't think, you might feel intimidated and think, oh, they're a very serious person and I feel like a clown. But actually, normally you come away from that just thinking, it's such a shame that they can't laugh. Yeah. And so therefore, I think there's a dose of humility that you need to laugh, particularly obviously at yourself. And so because the Christian life is life, and because the Bible is for all life, for therefore the Bible and the Christian story to never be funny think would be very odd. And when you actually read scripture, and if you take scripture seriously, it's not possible to take scripture seriously and not find any of it funny, because some of it is obviously funny. So I think if you're missing that, then you're not actually paying attention to the text. So I'm not saying that Jesus was a stand-up comedian, but he could be funny and was, but frequently wasn't. And I'm not saying that the New Testament's a sitcom or anything, but there are very funny moments of juxtaposition where very strange things happen, or very odd things happen, and it would be very hard if you were making a movie of it to not have that play out comically.
That's so true. And I think, like you say, the Bible is life, and there is so many things, as you've already described, I think so aptly, about when you take a step back, you really have to laugh at some things. I think many a times have I made promises that I would never do something, and I find myself doing it. That is really funny. And especially if to eat your words, how many times is that something that I think many of us who subscribe to the Christian faith are like, God, never, I will never do this, never put me there. And we find ourselves doing the very thing. Because
Cut to, here I am, doing the thing. Yeah.
An absolute going joke. So it's lovely to hear someone, I think, quite purposefully focused on highlighting that, because this is a challenging life, and we've been gifted not only salvation, but we've been gifted a love story that shows us all of the human interaction between this amazing God and humanity. But also there's room for laughter in it, and I think that's so exciting. 20 years though, and you've never felt like you've wanted to veer off into anything else. Why? Like, what has grounded you in the comedy genre? I think that's incredible.
Well, I mean, it's kind of too late for anything else now, I think, isn't it? And I now, because even as you were talking then about realizing that you're doing this or that, I was just thinking, in my line of work, you call that a bicycle cut, and for some reason, and it's because you can imagine someone just going, no way, there is no way you're going to get me on a bicycle. Cut to person on bicycle.
On bicycle.
I don't know why it's called that. It's just like that's sort of a typifying example of someone just sort of saying no way, and then you cut to the moment they're doing. I mean, that's kind of a real sitcom moment, isn't it? But I think so. There's an element of personal interest and character. I'm an optimist. I like happy endings. Sitcoms, although they're funny and things go wrong, they always come up trumps at the end somehow. There's always that Pyrrhic victory where somebody has set out on their quest and they haven't quite succeeded, but they haven't quite failed either, and they've sort of learned something along the way. And so I just find that sort of endlessly fascinating. I mean, I have moved into a bit more kind of murder mystery stuff as well, but in a way that's quite sitcom-ish because it is so formulaic. It is, and the audience are very, very happy with, we know that there's a murder. We know it's not real because a murder would be absolutely devastating. You can't, Miss Marple, this trail of bodies that goes wherever. I mean, she should be locked up, because she's obviously incredibly dangerous. And maybe she did all of them, because she is the common... She is the common theme.
Yeah, she is.
God, absolutely. Yeah.
That's so funny.
So I think... So yeah, I've kind of always veered away a little bit, but whenever I'm doing stuff, so I'm developing a murder mystery at the moment for a broadcaster, and I've written it as a sitcom, and I'm trying to write it as a sitcom because I just want the comedy to win rather than this great big clever murder mystery reveal, which is satisfying, but it's never quite as exciting as people think it's going to be, and I'd rather make somebody laugh for an hour than make them ponder for an hour and then give them this great big reveal at the end, because they might have gone to bed by then. So
I love that this constant interplay between both there, that you're like, well, okay, I've been given this task slightly off, but how do I make it comedy or sitcom? Do you find more joy or say satisfaction in the writing element, or seeing the fruition of it kind of in its interplay when it's done kind of like a final product? What's your preference, or do you have one?
They're both different parts of it. I think the thing that I have no interest in is watching the final result once it's been edited. And so there are radio programs that I've written. I did a series called Hut 33, which is about Bletchley Park Code Breakers in Bletchley Park in World War II. And I don't think I've literally listened to many of those episodes since I sat in the audience watching it being recorded. I don't think I listened to it being broadcast. I don't think I've listened to it subsequently. I have a rough idea of what happened in some of the episodes. I can't really remember. So I don't particularly like going back, because when I do that, I tend to just think, oh, that bit didn't work. No, I never quite sorted that bit out. Oh no, that's a bit of a hole in the plot, I've just realized. So I'm not a completer finisher. And when I wrote a show called Bluestone 4-2 about bomb disposal in Afghanistan, and actually that's on iPlayer at the moment, if anyone's interested in soldiers swearing at each other in very dangerous situations in Afghanistan with jokes. He was always much better sitting with the producer and going through the final edit and just going, no, we need to cut that bit, no, we need to stay on that shot for longer, and then we go to the thing. And I'm just like, oh, it's fine. I'm bored of it. Can we just think of some new jokes now, please? So I tend to get more excited at the beginning with all the possibilities. And then as it gets closer and closer to the end, I sort of want it to be over. So I think, and therefore, when we write together, Richard Hurst and I, we're actually quite a good team. He's not a believer, but we tend to think that if something makes both of us laugh, then we're onto something pretty good.
We're in a good sweet spot there. I love that. That's incredible. Yeah. You've spoken about, and you have a podcast, is that correct, called Cooper and Cary Have Words. I love that title.
That's right.
That's amazing. Tell us about the podcast, because obviously, again, another example or stream or another facet of all that you do. Tell us a little bit about the podcast.
So I am friends with a man called Barry Cooper. And actually, he was a comedian. He was very funny at university. He wasn't at my university, and he became an actor. And then he gave that up in order to help write the Christianity Explored course. And he sort of worked for them for a number of years. And he packed in the acting, which I think is a real shame. And I've told him that, why are you wasting your life telling people about Jesus when you could have been a comedy actor?
It's the Great Commission, sure.
Yeah. Well, and the reason I say that is because particularly young, what you might call fighting age males, anyone in that area who's good with words will always be encouraged into ministry. And that's fine. Can they not all be encouraged into ministry? Because for those of us who aren't in ministry, who are out there in the secular media, it's quite lonely out here, especially within comedy. So if anyone's got the chops to do comedy, can we have some of those? Because all we've got at the moment really is also a lot of disaffected, so very successful comedian called James Acaster. Brilliant, really funny, really original, raised in a Christian home. And that comes through in his act. And he doesn't deny it at all. He's quite open about it. Obviously not a Christian believer now. Okay. So there are lots of very successful ex-Christians. Katie Brand would be another one. But it would be great if some people kicked around a bit. So anyway, Barry worked for them for a while. He moved to Florida. He met an American lady, married, lived in Florida, worked for Ligonier Ministries. And now he's gone full. He's now a pastor. So now he's, even worse. He's now pastoring a church.
He? Oh,
how dare he? Yeah. So anyway, a few years ago, we had a chat, and I just said, it'd be great to do a podcast where we talk about Christian things from our own, fairly reformed Christian conservative perspective. We're pretty well aligned on most things, but not all actually, and that kind of makes the conversation usually, in my view, at least, interesting. And I'm the one that edits it, so I guess I have to find it interesting. And yeah, so we've just done an episode which drops very soon about should I watch The Chosen? Is that a good use of visual media? Is that okay? Should we be portraying Jesus on screen? Those sorts of questions. Or we talk about how Christians use power, or what's this whole anxiety thing? Is it, do not be anxious about anything? How does that play into it? So we tend to discuss these sort of Christian living things, but have a bit of an arts bent as well. We recently did one to tie in with National Novel Writing Month, NaNoWriMo, to say, hey, if you're a Christian, have you thought about writing a novel? Yeah. Because it would be great. And if you're thinking, but my novel will be terrible, I would say to you, well, of course it will be terrible. Your first novel is always terrible. That's a given. But your second one will be good. But you can't write a second one and a good one until you've written a terrible one. So get the terrible one out of the way. And so I'm often a bit of a rabble rouser in terms of just getting people to lean into their creative, because lots of people, I think people maybe think that I can't do it professionally, so I'm not going to do it. And you think, well, actually, even professionals, a lot of people aren't doing it professionally. I'm pretty unusual in that I've not done any significant non-writing work or non-podcast producing work for 25 years. I have made my made my living exclusively from pretty much writing.
Wow.
And that's rare. And I'm just very blessed that I happen to be good at something that actually pays okay, and it's very lumpy, and there have been good times and bad times, and it's been pretty close a couple of times. But I like to encourage people to have a go at it as well. And I've ended up involved in the Keswick Unconventional as well, where I think I'm kind of quite keen to get other people to just have a think about what it would be to get more involved in the creative. So Cooper and Cary Have Words, our podcast, which was his title, actually. I'm glad that you like the title. Annoyingly, it's his. But I'm a writer, so I have to credit him. He came up with it. I can't remember what my terrible suggestion was, but when he said Cooper and Cary Have Words,
I really enjoy.
I said, could it be Cary and Cooper Have Words? And no, annoyingly, Cooper and Cary works better. Yeah,
there's a real ring to it. I love it, and I love it. Like, we're having words. I mean, for me, it sounds like cool. Normally, when someone used to say, "I'd like to have a word," it's normally we're about to have some form of confrontation or that kind of thing.
Yes, that's right. I think we should have words about that.
You should have words about that. But I really like the spin-off on it. It just sounds so humorous and some really engaging topics from what you've just described. And anyone that comes across this conversation, please go and pursue that. I think that it would be really enriching. I love that you've spoken about it. It's almost like a call to all the Christians, a call to arms. What have you got in your creative, arsenal that you can bring to the fore? And there is something to be said, I think, across the board, but particularly in Christian communities, about, will it be of value if I bring this here? Will it be taken seriously? I think it's almost like a double disqualifier, almost. Personally, do we have? If I do, will it be any good? What's going to be the use of it here? What value that there is? But I think you're absolutely right. The idea is if you've been gifted with something, you have to give it the opportunity to have its day in the sun. Yeah. Whether it's for one person, whether it's for multitudes. Get into that, tapping into that space, and normally we end up finding ourselves in that process. It's not linear one way, it's very like two-way. I end up benefiting, I end up growing when I engage with that. So I love that this is what you're calling people to write. Would you have any words of encouragement for our Christians and media community? We've got an array of young up-and-coming writers, not sure like how to tread this walk. What would be your encouragement for them?
Well, one encouragement is, although I've said, a lots of people do get encouraged into ministry, and that's a shame. The upside of being a young Christian creative is that you've already got, if you're a member of a church, and if you're not a member of a church, be a member of a church. I don't have to go to church to be a Christian. Yes, of course you do. Well, we're not going to get into that. I think there's even a podcast episode about that. But if you're a member of a church, you're already with a bunch of people who are for you. Yeah. They're on your side. They actually want to help. They want to pray for you. They might even, if you put on a gig of some sort, if you're a singer-songwriter or whatever, they'll come, and some of them will enjoy it. And they might buy your album and that sort of thing. And I just think Christians have got such a strong, broad base that actually our unbelieving friends don't have. And it's no surprise that an awful lot of creatives come from Christian backgrounds. I mentioned James Acaster, but singer-songwriters like, Mumford & Sons, played in worship bands. Chris Martin from Coldplay comes from a Christian family as well.
Wow, I had no clue about that. So interesting.
Awful lot. Yeah, I did a camp with Chris Martin, a kids camp, many years ago. And so he does an amazing Alan Partridge impression, by the way, because Alan Partridge was really big at the time. That's how long ago it was. This is before he went to university and founded a band. It was like, what happened to Chris? He went to university. I think he started a band called Coldplay. Coldplay.
Wow.
What a terrible name for a band. So that's not going to go very far. I gather he's done fine. I don't know. I've lost touch with him.
I wonder. Yes.
Yeah. But if you're part of a Christian community, you're already got a really big advantage. And I don't think you need to feel bad about just saying, I'm doing this thing. What do you think?
Mm-hmm.
I'm doing this thing. Could you come? And then you'll just get a sense of it. You get a sense of what you're doing, and you might get some interesting advice. You might get some feedback. You might get some feedback that's well-meaning but completely wrong. You might, but you know. So I think, yeah, I would really encourage people to do something in public, because I think a lot of people maybe like the idea of, say, being a writer.
Yes.
And so, well, write. There's nothing to stop you from writing. You could start a Substack and write every week, every month. I mean, I'm quite busy and I have a weekly Substack because it's just good discipline for me. And actually today of all days, on the day of recording, I basically ran out of time and put up something which is like, this time last year, I wrote about this, but normally about 48 weeks a year, I managed to write an original, 800 words about something that I'm thinking about at the moment. And you just start to develop those skills. There's like exercising muscles.
I think the discipline of what you've described is a really key element, because it is one thing to have, great dreams, sitting there in some kind of space above reality and, execution. And then once we get going, you just need to visit it and just keep visiting it. And then you'll see real development there. And I think that's really, really encouraging for anyone to come through. You spoke about that you are able to write about 800 words, every 8 weeks, etc.
Every week, yeah,
and which is incredible. I do love that, and there's probably testament to the discipline that you've spoken about, as in, like, you've cultivated this habit, you've cultivated how you visit this space. How do you feel about navigating being a writer, being authentic, coming up with original thoughts and ideas and creativity in a scope where we now have AI that is doing all of this for people? How do you feel about navigating what you do in your gift in this kind of world?
Yeah, thank you. I've started using AI, but I use it for research. So it's basically a really, really good Siri/Google. So I might get it to find out something for me and to say, give me 100-word summary on bum, 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 bum. Or can you just aggregate this information on that? Or it's actually quite good for titles. So when I'm coming up with new program ideas, I just like, here's the basic idea. Think of 20 titles, and 17 of them are rubbish. 2 of them are okay, and 1's probably quite good. And I probably wouldn't have come up with it. And so it just gives you. So to me, it feels like a bit of an accelerator for research and just bouncing around ideas, getting it to write original stuff. Well, it can't write original stuff because it's by definition an aggregator. It's a mimic. So yeah, I mean, it's that the genie's out of the bottle, the toothpaste is out of the tube. We now live in a world of nuclear weapons, which we can't uninvent, and AI. And so I just think it needs to be harnessed in the right way. The idea that that AI could write an episode of a situation comedy, which is my line of work, I don't think that's happening anytime soon. Because it's just, so it could make something that would remind you of a comedy. And actually, I read scripts that are like that, so I used to do a podcast called Sitcom Geeks, where I was teaching people how to write situation comedy, and there are 222 episodes of that up on the internet if you want to go and look for them. And I stopped doing it because we were saying the same things all the time. But sometimes you would read a script that you just think, this just feels like a 1980s sitcom, and the person who's written it clearly loves them, and they've sort of written fan fiction, but with an original setting. So it's sort of Heidi High or Dad's Army or Fawlty Towers, but it's set somewhere else.
Yeah.
And this isn't original. But having said that, well done. You've done 30 pages. It kind of makes sense. And you've got to start somewhere. And again, it's like that first novel. You've written it. You've got that out your system. Okay, now what do you really want to do? What are you really interested in? So I think So in a way, it's, I mean, a double-edged sword implies that
Yeah.
it's bad news in two ways or something. I'm not quite sure, but
But I
it
think it's
is what it
important.
is.
It is what it is, and I think these are important conversations in terms like what do we do in this space, and
Yeah.
clearly your approach is use it as a tool. So understanding that whatever it generates, it's not going to be original, and therefore there is still scope for fresh things to come through. It doesn't have to be intimidating
Yeah.
or kind of all doom and gloom, which I think is really, really healthy. What do you perceive in terms of the role of comedy in today's media landscape? Because I think it's taken some interesting seasons and cycles
Yeah.
through. What are your thoughts about where it sits today?
It seems to be sitting outside on its own, not doing very much. I think there is a sad lack of just feel good, funny
Mm,
comedy.
mm,
So there's lots of comedy drama. There's lots of interesting comedy, representing new voices and new communities and that kind of stuff, and that's all fine.
mhm.
But at a time like this, when everything seems quite dark and bleak and polarized, it just feels like we need another Friends.
Yeah.
It feels like we need another Parks and Recreation. Feels like we need another Only Fools and Horses. And it's not immediately obvious to me that there's any. I think channels would like the idea of commissioning that stuff, but if you show them it, they sort of are a bit terrified.
Mm.
So that's kind of what I've been buffing up against in my world, trying to get stuff on TV. I think they're rather hoping that some big name comedians will decide, like, not going out with Lee Mack, a very well known comedian.
Mm.
I guess in that sense, it's sort of playing it safe, and therefore it's the famous person comedian show, which lacks a certain amount of authenticity that you get in Only Fools and Horses and Vicar of Dibley or whatever. So yeah, I think, and then the other. So there's kind of the lack of the mainstream comedy, and there's the one show that's very popular is Ghosts, which is there's only 6 episodes a year. They've done 5 series, and that's going to be the end of it. And it's just a very joyful, happy show, but it's a bit of an outlier. But then on the other side, you've just got this whole contentious, be very careful what you say when you're joking. And, the cancel culture is still quite
Yes.
strong.
I'm glad
Yeah.
that you mentioned that. I guess I think it might have been Ricky Gervais who said that he feels that audiences now are very sensitive. Do you agree with that? And how does
Oh,
that
yeah.
feel with regards to like
Well,
does comedy have a freedom anymore in the way that it used to? Like you said, because we're living in a very very set idea of cancel culture that we see propping up here and there.
yeah. I mean, in one sense, I wonder if the audience is as on edge as we think. But the
Mm,
fact is, they may be not on edge for themselves, but they may be on edge about what other people may be thinking. And there's no doubt that some good things have happened of where people no longer joke. Don't joke about the physical appearance of women. That's a horrible thing to do. If it's
mm,
derogatory, it's not
mm, mm,
funny.
mm.
And that's not on. And that's good. That feels like progress. But then there are other things where you say, well, you can't joke about this. Well, if you joke about this, well, therefore you could also joke about that, and that's not funny. And so there's a certain amount of mind games going on, certain amount of power grabbing going on. And the moment everyone's sort of on edge, it's quite difficult for it to be genuinely funny in a way that people just find liberating and joyful. Like Michael McIntyre, brilliant mainstream comedian, who has found a nice way of doing the mainstream sort of stuff. But the moment you go away from that, suddenly everything is rather politicized and difficult. But then even the stuff that isn't politicized is aggressively not politicized. And it just feels like there's a bit of a turf war going on, which suddenly, which people who've just had a long day at work and would just like to spend 12 quid and go to a comedy club and laugh. It's like, what do they want? They haven't gone to a comedy club to be educated. They have gone to be entertained. And I think there's just always that fine balance about the difference between the artist and the entertainer. And I think both are very, very noble things. And it doesn't really help to use one to, look down on the other.
Yeah, yeah.
So the great folks of like Bob Hope and Bing Crosby of the 1940s, who were entertainers, and they just wanted to, make people laugh and smile when the war was on, things like that, and things were pretty hard. But equally, there are people who their art is everything, and the expression of their art is really important, and that's great too. We need both, but I think we don't. So there are comedians who do really interesting things. Stuart Lee's obviously one of them. I've been to see him live a few times, and say James Acaster is really interesting as well. Sorry, my daughter's obsessed with him. That's why I'm thinking about him quite a lot. I've seen quite a lot of his stuff
household
recently.
Name, nonetheless.
In our household, he is a household name. He would be treated like a conquering hero if he came to our house. But yeah, so it is difficult. I mean, I wrote a book on this exact subject called The Sacred Art of Joking, where I was trying to work out how it all works. And again, it's not as funny as you might think, but hopefully it is a funny book. But there are lots of
questions to consider, and it's and I think, in many ways there is such a necessity for laughter moving forward. But what does that look like in a world where is the space for it, where it's not even allowed some form of, I think, justified freedom in what it does in terms of bringing joy or bringing consideration to other things. I mean, I see a lot of other comedians. I'm sure you're familiar with Trevor Noah as well. Huge comedy, but he speaks a lot about actually uses it as a way to really speak about some of the traumas of the South African apartheid, which he lived in the life of. I get both educated and entertained at the same time. And when I see, particularly when he is entertaining or speaking to others who come from the same country, like, he makes it okay to laugh because everybody's dealing with those issues. We can see the importance of laughter as a therapy, actually, how necessary that is for something that is very grave, very deep, very serious, like a context like that, for example. So I'm so grateful that you're there posing the questions. Where is this place? Let's not be too quick to start shoving everything aside. And
that's the skill. And the skill of the artist is that he's able to combine those two in a way that is actually quite surprising. And as long as people kind of know what they're getting when they come, I mean, there is stuff that teeters over too much into the messaging. And there's quite a funny Stuart Lee joke about that, where he says, I went to see a comedian, and I didn't laugh, but I agreed the heck out of it. Something like that. And it was like, I've just really put his finger on. And he's one of those comedians who is kind of messing around in that way, which I think is quite interesting. And he knows, he's so self-aware that he knows exactly how he's coming across. But I guess the other thing is, I mean, being offended is not the worst thing to happen to you. And if causing offense is a sin, well, we've got some serious theological problems there, because Jesus offended people.
Every left way and said, it is an offensive gospel, is it not?
The gospel is offensive, but Jesus went out of his way to offend people. He said things that he knew they would find what we would say triggering. His claim, and so he just sort of says things, quotes things. When he says, before Abraham was, I am, he knows exactly what he's saying there. And he knows that they're going to go absolutely berserk over what he's saying, comparing himself to Yahweh of the Old Testament. It's like, and so he knows he's doing it. And therefore, have I offended someone is not the first criteria, and so, and it's fascinating how Jesus interacts with people, because they're always very awkward and strange conversations. And the moment you think something's going well, somebody, rich young ruler in Mark runs up to him and says, good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus immediately says, why do you call me good? It's like, oh, he's just asked about how to get eternal life, and suddenly you're turning the question on him. Just tell him, but he's having this conversation. Do you know what I mean? It's like, he just is always answered. There's always, I think in the Gospels, he asks over 300 questions, and lots of those are in response to questions. Very awkward dinner guest, very embarrassing. Do you know what I mean? He's very embarrassing, very, very difficult. And therefore, if we want nice, polite kind of stuff in the culture, well, that's fine, but that's not what Christianity is offering, and that is not the Christ that the Bible presents. So we're going to have to kind of get over that one, because the nice, polite people who didn't want to be offended, they were the ones who killed Jesus.
Yeah.
So I don't want to be on that team. So we just want to be really careful that we're not, I know it sounds silly, but we're not holier than Jesus. That we're not sort of putting barriers up around what we can and can't say in order to protect this idea of holiness. Whereas Jesus, you know, I was just reading this morning about how when Jesus heals the demon-possessed man in Mark with Legion, you know, you could not get a more unclean place than where Jesus goes, where he is among tombstones, unclean. He's possessed by demons, unclean. You know, everything's wrong.
Unholy environment.
yeah. And so Jesus goes there, and it would have been scandalizing. And yet, ironically, you know, Jesus
is in the midst of it.
Jesus is, but he. Yeah, so there are lots of things going on there. So the more you actually closely read what the text says, the more you think that Jesus was very, very, very difficult.
I love also how you speak about this issue of offense, and I want to ask you, because you speak about this on your website about occupying two worlds, and I think effectively that's a good connection to what you're talking about now. Jesus in his environment being offensive to one world, but also literally bringing the kingdom with him wherever he goes, in places that everybody else would deem you don't go there, and that's where he would be. How do you find occupying secular world with regards to your work, which you've done so well, and also occupying, I think, in a very strong way, your Christian life as well? How do you find navigating those two spaces?
I've been very blessed by having a personality that I can now see in my younger of two daughters. In fact, they're both a bit like this, which is they don't mind being the odd one out. They don't care. And I think that's a bit of I'm pleased to see that, because I just think, oh yeah, I think at school I was a bit like that as well. So I don't mind being the only alternative voice, but I'm also very happy to be, not very happy, but I'm also prepared to be ignored. So I don't mind being the only Christian in a room. I don't mind putting my hand up and saying, by the way, I'm not sure about this. And everyone can just go, shut up. And I'm just like, well, okay. I don't agree, but okay, carry on. So I think there's a way of disagreeing that, that can be done well. I think it's partly, there are some people who would be in a situation, they go, I cannot be here whilst you do this and I'm going to leave. And if they think they should do that, then they should do that. But I think everyone just needs to find where their sweet spot, bite point is on those sorts of things. So yeah, I mean, I guess there's an element of age to it as well. I'm a bit more confident now than I was. And early in your career, you're thinking, am I going to blow my career by being a Christian? And that means that sort of dead on arrival. And actually, I don't think, that's just not true. Right? I think as a Christian, again, if you're thinking deeply about life, about people, about biblical truth, again, you've got an advantage. I don't think other people think as deeply as Christians tend to. The idea that you would go to a Bible study, so we have a Bible study at our house every 2 weeks, and we really think about things. And we just were looking at how did Solomon end up married to 700 women?
Honestly, a very good question.
A very good question. But we were thinking, well, how would I get into a situation where I'm doing something truly terrible when it's so obviously from the outside the wrong thing to do? And I'm just thinking, well, that's kind of my day job, is working out how does a character make a series of terrible decisions where one decision on its own doesn't actually look so bad, but there's this trail of breadcrumbs that takes you to the wrong place. So if you're wrestling with these issues as part of your faith, I think you've got another advantage. And there are things that you can or can't do, the things that you may or may not want to write about. You may not want to write. I mean, you're probably not going to, not that pornography needs much scripting, but you're probably not going to work in a genre that is quite as blatantly sinful as that. But, I've written a show about, as I mentioned before, bomb disposal in Afghanistan, and the soldiers use military grade language at each other because that's how soldiers talk. And to have them not talk like that would actually be very strange and unrealistic.
Unrealistic.
And I don't talk like that, and I shouldn't. and people who are watching it, I don't think should. But it's understandable that the people who are being shot at by the Taliban and trying to be blown up would use certain words that we wouldn't want to use on a podcast, a Christian podcast, particularly. So, I think it's just a question of finding out where you're comfortable and how you're comfortable expressing yourself. And sometimes your Christian tribe finds it hard to understand why you would do this or that, or say, well, I can't believe a Christian was involved in X, Y, and Z,
How do you find those moments, and what's normally your response in that environment when maybe you are challenged on that?
I think it's often quite annoying. I do know that another Christian I know in my world was criticised by someone in a particular situation I don't particularly need to go into, and they were like, well, I can't believe that a Christian would be involved in a show like that. And I thought to myself, you don't know how television's made, do you? And you don't know what it's like to work in the industry, and you don't know what it was like before this Christian got hold of that script and suggested those jokes and did that job. And so I think particularly in my world, fairly conservative, evangelical, reformed world, there's quite a lot of personal purity problems where it's like, I can't be anywhere near sin. I can't be anywhere near this, and I can't be tainted. And it's like, well, that's just not, I mean, tell that to Joseph in the courts of Pharaoh. Tell that to Daniel, the chief magician, to Nebuchadnezzar. Yeah. I take it he didn't practice sorcery and necromancy, but that he somehow found a way of holding that position. And so, I guess people don't really understand how it works.
Yeah, those are really, really, really good questions and really good things to raise about that. Do we know what was happening before as a result of that Christian body in that room and impacting and influencing X and Y body of work? What is actually happening? And I think that's an opportunity to take a step back and reconsider that, because I think you're right. Within the Christian culture, we are very quick to say, like, it's got to look this way and it's got to look that way. And you're absolutely right. You also need to have discernment about, is this going to be detrimental, and is this actually somewhere that I'm supposed to be doing that gets people closer to a glorification of God and his ways and whatever. It is a tension. I imagine is quite tricky, but grateful to have voices like yourself speaking there. And this makes sense with regards to your rally earlier of recruiting others. Find yourselves in these spaces. The more of us that are here in numbers, the bigger the influence, I imagine, as well.
Yeah, and we can just share stories about how to cope with this sort of thing. And the other thing is to say, it is a team game. So that bomb disposal show, there is a sex scene in it. And it goes further than I'm happy with. But I'm only the co-writer of the show, not the sole writer. And there was a production team and there were lots of voices in the room. And if it had been me, I would have cut sooner. I don't think we needed to have what we had. But that it's like, if you want total artistic control, that's fine. You will need to raise £1.2 million to make your own 6-part sitcom. And then you can do it exactly as you like. But if you want to work in the world where there's a variety of voices and a plurality of viewpoints, then great. If you don't want that, be a novelist. You have absolute total control over every single word, and you know exactly how your book is going to be perceived, because there's no distance between your text and the reader. But the moment you're writing a script, you're already admitting that you're ceding some kind of control. And if you don't want that, that's fine. But then screenwriting is probably not for you.
James, this has been an incredible conversation. I want to thank you so much for your time today. And you raised such great questions and thoughts for consideration for our young up-and-coming mentees in the network of Christians in media. And how do we navigate really important challenges that we're going to face? This is the world we're living in. How do we hold on to, personal faith, testimony, but also be somewhere that is impactful in something that can be quite daunting in a world that wants nothing really to do sometimes with what we represent. This has been amazing. You can sign up to James's newsletter, Don't Mention It, on his website, jamescary.co.uk, and you can also purchase his book, Sacred Art of Joking, as was mentioned earlier. So, and please connect with him at James Cary, which is his handle. James, any final words to our young and aspiring writers, anyone that's occupying faith in media, that you could leave us with a top tip before you go?
I think, yeah, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And I think you just want to make sure that just do the work that's in front of you and then try to do it better next time and do it better next time. So you're, you know, and when you do get those opportunities, you just want to make sure that you've got the skills to make the most of them. So it's good to be hungry. And I wanted to get a sitcom on TV onto BBC One in my 20s. And I nearly got there with a radio show. And I can now look back and go, I wasn't ready for that. And I'd have been absolutely cut to pieces by critics if I'd been given what I wanted then. Yeah. So it's a long game. So, you know, work on those skills, but also, yeah, just have a community of believers around you, both inside the media, but also outside the media, who can just pray for you, because it's, you know, it's going to be a long journey, but it is worth it. And, well, I think it's worth it anyway.
It is.
I shan't say any more than that.
Absolutely worth it. James, this has been incredible. Thank you so much for your time, and we wish you all of the best with your future endeavours. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Carla. Thanks for listening, everyone.
You've been listening to Faith in Media with Carla Adebekun. Make sure you catch our episodes and hit subscribe. Please share and leave us a comment. Christians in Media is a UK charity that supports, encourages and inspires Christians from across the ever-changing media landscape. Find out more at www.christiansinmedia.co.uk and connect with us via our socials.